The Vietnam War is one of those things in history that I think we all have a general idea about. But even having family members who served, I still had a lot of misconceptions coming into this expert interview. Welcome to the Just Dumb Enough podcast, a show that acknowledges no one is always an expert by dispelling misconceptions with real experts. I'm your host as always, Colton Petrie. My guest today is Robin Bartlett. Robin was a lieutenant in the 1st Cav and completed over 50 helicopter-based assaults. He shares not only his extreme experiences in combat, but also the changes in life, going to Vietnam and coming back from it to a world that wasn't necessarily happy to see the troops return. He's got an excellent book out now if any of you are interested in learning more. You might also notice during this interview my extra gravelly voice. I was still very sick when we recorded. Let's welcome these soldiers home. Welcome to the show, Robin Bartlett.
Thank you. Good to be here, Colin. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you on the show. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit for the audience?
Sure. I am a three-generation military person. My grandfather went to West Point. My father went to West Point. My brother went to West Point. And I turned down an appointment to West Point because I decided that after 13 elementary and middle schools and 4 high schools, I had had enough of the military. But as I started college in Southern California, I went to Claremont McKenna College. As I started there, it was the buildup of the Vietnam War, and I did not wish to be drafted. There was a tradition of officers in my family, so I knew I pretty much had to serve my obligation as an officer, and so I went into the ROTC program, and it was second nature for me. We answered the telephone at home. Colonel Bartlett's quarters, may I help you, sir? That's how we answered the phone at home. And so there's a tremendous military tradition. We took service to our country very seriously. I mean, those words meant something to us. So we were that's what my father's profession was, service to our country. And I did not wish to be drafted, and I did wish to serve my obligation as an officer. So that's how I kind of got into this Vietnam situation. And it was the height and the buildup of the war. And I knew once I was commissioned as an officer and graduated on the same day, I knew that's where I was going eventually.
And it doesn't seem like a uncommon story, when talking to people to hear like, well, I joined because I didn't want to get drafted.
Right. It was a time when the draft was a really large issue. We needed a lot of troops because Kennedy and Johnson both escalated the war dramatically during that period of time. And Westmoreland, who was the commanding general in Vietnam, decided that we needed a lot of American troops to completely eliminate the North Vietnamese threat.
So how old were you when you joined ROTC?
So I graduated from college on June the 6th, 1967. I was commissioned on the same day as a second lieutenant. I was 21 years old, and after about a year of training and service in the 82nd Airborne Division, that's where I did most of my after basic training, officer basic training and airborne training and ranger training. I served with the 82nd Airborne Division in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which is now called, they renamed all the military bases. That's now called Fort Liberty, and was with the 82nd Airborne Division. I went to Vietnam at the age of 22. May the 9th, 1968 was when I flew from Travis Air Force Base to Bien Hoa, Vietnam.
And it seems like, you have a lot of history, like you said, quite a long history in your family of, voluntary military service, officers. Was there a noticeable difference in that time before you went overseas? Could you tell like the difference between someone who was voluntarily there versus someone who had been drafted?
Well, of course, the all of the off I was in an officer community, and so almost all of us were either ROTC or West Pointers. There were a few OCS officers, officer candidate school. So all of us were volunteers. The infantry officers were all volunteers. No one would, as an officer, would be drafted. If you were drafted, you went in as an enlisted man, and then if you were bright enough, you could apply for officer candidate school. So I would say that I'm just guessing at these percentages, but about 60% of the infantry officers I came in contact with, maybe that's high. 40% were West Pointers, and 10% were OCS, and the rest were ROTC.
So, what were your first days like? Like obviously you had a lot of experience, here at home, moving around, all those things. What was the first day stepping into Vietnam like?
So I've talked to a lot of veterans, and when we got off the airplane, and it was a commercial flight with female um, flight attendants, and I think that was the last time I saw an American woman for the entire year I was in Vietnam, because even I got wounded, and even on the hospital ship, there were no females. I don't think I saw what we called them round eyes. I don't think I saw a female for the entire year I was in Vietnam. Although I know they were there, I just never saw them. The two things that veterans talk about when arriving, well, three things really. When arriving in Vietnam is number one, the heat. And the flight attendants ask us to pull down the shades to try and keep the heat out. Number two was the smell when we got off the plane, just this horrendous odor. And third was the fact that as we got off, there were troops that were leaving Vietnam getting on. And of course, they harassed us and yelled at us. But those are the three memories I recall, getting off that plane and waiting for buses to come and take us to the replacement depot.
And that seems like, a couple of things that would definitely shock the system
Oh yeah. Oh
for
yeah.
real.
It was a hell of a shock. And almost most of my flight were second lieutenants. I would say 90% of them were second lieutenants, and then there were some field grade officers who were going back for second tours. And maybe a few captains, but mostly majors and lieutenant colonels who were going back for second tours, and they stayed by themselves. So we were, for the most part, we were all butter bars, as they called us.
Gotcha. So, you have that first experience, obviously stepping off the plane. Do they start you out like trying to build a day in, day out routine, or is it just like, everything will change every day from now on, and that is how it is?
So I was with the 82nd Airborne Division in the United States, and they wanted to try to keep airborne officers in airborne units in Vietnam. So I actually had orders transferring me to the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam. However, when I arrived, it was just after the Tet Offensive of 1968. And that was a major turning point in the Vietnam War, both in the United States and in Vietnam. The entire political environment in the United States and public opinion did a 180-degree turn after Vietnam. And in Vietnam, the casualties that occurred during that period of time, even though we killed enemy forces 10-1, we lost more people during that Tet Offensive, more Americans than at any other period of time, and then at any other year, 1968. So it was a major turning point in Vietnam as well, and because of all the officer casualties, all orders were canceled. So when I arrived in the replacement depot, they just said, "Stand by. We'll let you know where you're going." And after 3 days of intense heat, just walking around in shorts and reading paperback books, taking as many showers as you could possibly take just to cool off. I got orders for the First Cav Division, and that turned out to be, in many respects, a very good thing because we had more helicopters in that division than they had in all of Vietnam, and that division was responsible for the air mobile concept. And the air mobile concept, very simply, was that still is to this day. You bring fresh troops to the battle by helicopter, as opposed to having them walk to the battle or run to the battle. So we went everywhere by helicopter, which allowed us to carry less on our backs and more water, more ammunition, and get frequently resupplied every day by helicopter, as long as they could land, come into the landing zone where we were, or even if they couldn't, they could hover overhead and kick out stuff to us. So that was the good part. The bad part, or the dangerous part, was that we would make helicopter combat assaults called Charlie Alphas, CA, helicopter combat assaults. And I made more than 50 helicopter combat assaults with my unit, and sometimes twice a day. Was not unusual to be walking through the boonies. We called it humping the boonies, and get a radio call saying, find an LZ, birds are inbound to pick you up in 20 minutes. Because the concept was, if we could spot an enemy unit, if we could spot an enemy force, we would assault a platoon and then a company right into that unit and engage the unit, and then bring these incredible resources that the first Cav had to bear on the enemy force. Trap them, block them, and completely disseminate them. That was the concept, the air mobile concept. So after 3 days, I was assigned to the First Cav Division and worked my way up. First, the replacement depot was in 3 Corps, and the division rear was in 2 Corps in An-Khê. So first flight was to An-Khê, and that's where we drew weapons and jungle fatigues, and I was carrying so much stuff. I was just loaded down, unbelievable amount of stuff, both military and personal. I took way too much stuff, and I thought I was taking the absolute minimum. When I came back, everything fit in a little tiny bag. That was it. And was then on K for about 3 or 4 days, and then moved to the division forward, which was in Camp Evans in I Corps. And I Corps is right along the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam, Gulf of Tonkin on the east, and Laotian border on the west. And that was our AO, area of operation, from the Gulf of Tonkin to the Laotian border. And most of my time was spent right around the Laotian border, because that was where the North Vietnamese soldiers were attempting to infiltrate through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And that terrain is mostly mountainous 3-canopy jungle. And that's, we spent some time out toward what we called the beach near the Gulf of Tonkin, but most of the time was in that mountainous terrain near the Laotian border.
Well, and I think most people that have seen, a Vietnam movie or a documentary or something are pretty familiar with like the image of a very, very thick jungle. Is that part of the reason that we started adopting this, helicoptering in and around policy? Was just because it was otherwise so hard to move people?
That was not one of the rationales. I mean, the whole idea behind this air mobile concept of the First Cav Division was to move troops by helicopter, and we moved. I mean, it was so densely, and we're talking about 3-canopy jungle. That means 3 layers of growth over your head, and the enemy preferred that terrain because it gave them cover from any kind of overflights that might see them. They always moved at night, and they moved in small groups. And then ultimately, when they felt they could attack a unit, whether it was be an ARVN unit Army of the South of Vietnam. That was the ARVN, South Vietnamese Army, or an American Army. They would mass meaning get together and attack when they felt they had a superior opportunity. They would almost always attack at night because they knew if it was during the day, we could bring superior forces to bear, which would be artillery and helicopter gunships and jets and napalm and gas and even battleships. On occasion, we would direct fire from battleships if we were close enough to the Gulf of Tonkin. That's a lot of firepower.
Yeah, that certainly is a lot of firepower. Like just thinking about all the things that could shoot at you.
Yep.
But it seems like, if you have the North Vietnamese troops running in these smaller groups, it's much more likely that you're going to like encounter them because they're kind of scattered everywhere instead of moving in like chunks of people. Is that the case?
That's correct. And the way we encountered them was with night ambushes. Every American company had at least 3 platoons. Typical strength of a company was about between 80 and 120 men, depending upon people on R&R, casualties, various things, people getting sick, etc. So I would say the average was around 90 men. And that allowed you to have 3 line platoons and a mortar platoon. A mortar platoon only carried 1 tube, 1 tube and 8 rounds. That was about it. So, except at night, that's when they brought in additional ammunition. But every platoon would send out an ambush every night. So I would take an ambush one night, and then my platoon sergeant would take an ambush the next night. We alternated between the two. And that would be a reinforced squad. And we would find a trail network or find a likely location where enemy soldiers would be moving, and we would set up to ambush that unit and take them out.
When you talk about the adrenaline of a life or death situation, like that is something that usually only happens to a person, once or twice in their life, but definitely not in this case. Like that amount of adrenaline has to be something to experience, like really otherworldly compared to normal life.
No question about it. It's pretty hairy to be in a firefight. And when I came into my unit, I was actually promoted to first lieutenant. I went in to I met the S1, that's the personnel officer, and I told him that my secondary specialty was as the S1. And he said, well, that's good because you'll be coming out of the field. An officer only served 6 to 7 months in the field. And then he said, you'll be coming out of the field about the same time I'll be going back to the world. That's what we call the United States, the world. And so if you survive your tour, we'll make you the S1. And so I went into the battalion commander's office that night, having just been promoted to first lieutenant, with 3 other officers. We went in alphabetically. So I went in first. And I listened to the battalion commander, who was literally dead on his feet. I think he'd been up straight for 2 days. I don't remember a thing he said. And at the end of his 2-minute speech, he asked the S1 where we needed these officers. And he said, well, we need 1 in A, 2 in B, and 1 in C. So I went to A, and the next 2 officers went to B, and the 4th officer went to C. I was the only one to survive that tour. The other 3 officers were either killed or wounded. And I think I survived my tour for 3 reasons. The first reason is I tried very, very hard not to do stupid stuff. Now, that may sound funny, but I was 22 years old. I'd had 3 courses of training. I had airborne school, which didn't do much for me in Vietnam except make me have me in really good physical condition. Infantry officer basic course, which was 50% field and 50% classroom, and Ranger School. And Ranger School was the best insurance policy any officer could have for surviving Vietnam, because that taught you so much about what you needed to do to survive. The second thing I did was that I sat down with my platoon sergeant and my squad leaders, and I said, listen, you guys have had more time in the field than I'm still the leader. But if you see me doing something wrong, I want you to tell me. And I won't always take your advice, but I want you to feel confident that you can always speak to me and tell me if you think I'm doing something wrong. And then the third thing I did was I listened to my point man. We typically would move through the jungle single file. Point man is out 50 meters in front, has a cover man about 5 meters behind him. And this was the guy who was in the most vulnerable position. And if that man, and we rotated that position every day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day if it was in deep jungle, if you had to cut your way with a machete. But if he came back or if he called me forward and said, I really just have this bad feeling. I don't hear any birds. I don't hear any monkeys chirping. I just have a bad feeling. I would shoot artillery out in front of us. That was called reconnaissance by fire. And I shot so much artillery that the artillery battery that supported us got to know my call sign, which was Foggy Day 1-6, one being the first platoon leader. Foggy Day is the A company, one is the first platoon, and 6 is the leader. And I shot so much artillery that they ultimately put a budget on me of 25 rounds. But that was enough. Then as we walked through that area, we know that there had been a substantial artillery barrage in front of us. And that made us feel a lot more confident. But I know that's a long answer to your question, but essentially, if you were in a firefight, the first thing you did, of course, was to hit the ground and pray. And the bullets are flying overhead. But as the leader, I mean, I could literally feel eyes turn toward me saying, give us direction, give us an order, tell us what to do. And you had to reach down inside and give orders, and you had to tell the men where you wanted them to move and where you wanted to be positioned. And sometimes that put men into harm's way. But you had to do that as the leader of the unit. If you did not do it, then it was left to individual decision. And that meant catastrophe. So John Wayne said it best. Courage is being scared to death and saddling up anyway. And that's literally what the leader had to do. Right or wrong, make a decision and follow through.
And, beyond the immediate rush that kind of comes like, oh, we're entering combat, right? Like hit the deck, start fire, whatever it is. Some of these encounters, I guess, throughout history have lasted very long periods of time. Was that an issue in the Vietnam conflict, or did everything kind of happen in short bursts?
Most of the ambushes, either when they ambushed us or we ambushed them, and more often than not, we ambushed them, were short bursts. They were, encounters with a small squad with 3 or 4 men, one man, whatever. And we were in a free fire zone up by the Laotian border, so there were no friendlies. And if you met someone, you killed them. End of story. You didn't ask questions, you just fired. And often many of these ambushes were of soldiers who were carrying their weapons on their shoulders. And we never carried our weapons on our shoulders. We always carried our weapons in our hands. And the point man carried his weapon on full automatic with the safety off. So it was not unusual. But the skirmishes, if you will, were small units. On a couple of occasions, one occasion in particular, we did run into an ambush by a fairly substantial enemy force, probably regimental size. And then, that was back to the air mobile concept that I was talking about before. You bring in the rest of the company, you bring in the rest of the troops, and you bring in all the resources that you possibly can. You try to block the enemy from escaping, which was very difficult, often very difficult. But you attack, and you attack with overwhelming superior forces to destroy and annihilate the enemy force.
And we had kind of talked, a little bit about this as you had talked about, some of the other officers that came in at the same time as you. But Vietnam has become pretty well known for a high casualty rate. And I don't want to be in any way indelicate about this, But did you have that same experience, very close inside of your units?
Sure. I mean, when you think about it, I always walked fourth in line. So I'm point man, cover man, and then I would have a usually my machine gunner and M60 Grenadier walk in front of me. That was my firepower, most firepower. But I was the guy with the map in his thigh pocket. I was the guy with the compass trying to figure out where he was, pulling the map out of my pocket, looking at the map. I was the guy with the radio operator standing behind me within arm's length to if I needed to talk on the radio. That was like putting a great big target on your back if there were snipers. There was no way to avoid that. Sometimes I put the radio operator in front of me. He did not like to walk in front of me. Actually, it was the guy in front of him did not like to have the radio operator walk in front, but we just changed it up a little bit. But I always walked at the front. My platoon sergeant always walked at the back, never changed that up. I was the leader. I was in front. But yeah, it was almost like putting a target. That was the hazardous situation of being an officer. Now, there was no patches. There were no patches and no rank insignia. The only way you knew I was an officer was on my helmet band that went across my camouflage helmet liner. It said LT Bartlett, but we didn't salute. We didn't call each other sir. They never addressed me as sir. My name was 1-6, and that's how I was referred to. And everybody either had a nickname or a number. I called my squad leaders by their number. I called my platoon sergeant by his number, 1-5.
And that was all kind of try and protect the organization of your small group because you're like, if I get shot first, like now that need to draw, leadership from somewhere deep inside, like that's passed to somebody else or scattered entirely.
Well, that's part of it. The other part of it is I never really wanted to get too close to my men. I mean, I did get close to my platoon sergeant, my radio operator, my medic, but not my men, because there were times when I had to tell them to do things that would really put them in harm's way. So I didn't want to have anything get in the way of that kind of a decision.
And then you said you were there for a year, like that was the standard deployment for everyone?
Correct. 1 year tour of duty. Officers served 6 to 7 months in the field, then rotated to a staff job.
And was there a lot of change, during that year of war?
Within the platoon?
Just in general, like the way that, either the war was fought or, the resources at hand or, the people around you, whatever it might be.
Not really. I mean, the standard daily activity was to move from point A to point B and set up a night defensive perimeter, NDP. And that move might be 5 kilometers, might be 10 kilometers. It would depend upon the terrain, where you were. Every once in a while, we would stay in a night defensive position for 1 or 2 days, depending upon the terrain. If it was really slow going, and we would set up at the top of a hill or top of a mountain and stay there for a day or two, but we would send out patrols every day. So you were humping every day. We would stay out for 4 to 6 weeks at a time, and during that time you would not change clothes. So you got to be pretty ripe. Wouldn't shave. Water was at a premium. So you got pretty dirty. I mean, there was enough water to drink and brush your teeth. That was about it. And we carried about 2 gallons of water. And sometimes if it was so hot, you go through that water by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And I'd be very cautious about heat exhaustion and heat stroke. And then after 4 to 6 weeks, they bring you in to pull base camp perimeter security around a battalion-sized base camp. Now, that would be about 600 men, and they would have bunkers around this base camp, well fortified, and you got a chance to have some hot food, a shower, clean clothes, and sleep during the day and pull security at night. So that was pretty much the routine that I followed with a few exceptions, for 7 months.
When it seems like that time at base is definitely a bit more pleasant than the rest of it, where you're like,
It
oh,
is.
look, hot
Yeah.
food and showers.
Well, and sleep because you didn't have all those ambushes, and you felt in a concrete bunker or a bunker that was covered with sandbags. You felt a whole lot more secure pulling perimeter security, and you got some sleep during the day. Could write letters, and the showers were exceptional.
Yeah. Well, and that's a stark contrast to, like you said, being out in the field. There's the risk of heat stroke at all times. No matter how much water you're taking in, you're sweating it back out.
That's
And
right.
then when it rains and it gets cold, I imagine it gets extremely cold.
Not really. I mean, there were some monsoon times when we could actually take a shower in the rain, as long as you washed off before the rain stopped. The rains would be intense, and almost like a shower. And we weren't allowed to drink the water in streams because of Agent Orange poisoning. But we would soak towels and rags in water and at least douse ourselves with water. But it never, to best of my knowledge, never got very cold. I never experienced any cold. I mean, a few times we carried a poncho and a poncho liner, and there were occasions in the morning where you'd wrap up in the poncho liner a little bit because it was chilly, but never cold. Never
Got-
cold.
Gotcha. I was just thinking about the sensation of like being drenched, like entirely to your
Oh yeah.
core, and then being like,
Oh
that
yeah.
is the time where I am the most cold in this world, is when
Yes.
I am completely soaked.
And those were very dangerous times because you couldn't hear anything, with the and you'd be wearing a poncho, which is plastic, and the rain would be hitting the plastic and making noise. So that was a very dangerous time as well. Any kind of a rainstorm at night, the enemy loved that. Enemy were the better night fighters than Americans. Americans would hole up, dig foxholes, and try and stay awake during the night. The enemy just was masters of infiltration.
Well, and especially, there's a bit of a home field advantage. Like if you've grown up in this terrain, it's a lot different than if you grew up in Nebraska, right? Like those are very different life experiences, and you're well prepared for one of them, depending on
Yep,
where you grew up.
that's
But
that's true.
but in and I don't know exactly when it is, you might have to lighten me on this. At some point, public opinion kind of turned on the war in Vietnam pretty stiffly to the point that it's become like, a moment in history where like, oh, and then all public opinion kind of turned against the war in Vietnam. Could you Were you overseas when that happened?
Yes, that was January, February, and March of 1968, right after the Tet Offensive. And prior to that time, Westmoreland and Johnson had both said, "We're winning the war. We're going to be successful. We're gonna train the South Vietnamese army to take over. But everything's going great. We need more troops, but everything's working out really, really well." And then the Tet Offensive occurred, and we lost a couple of thousand soldiers. And America suddenly woke up and found out, especially when you found 2,000 survivor assistance officers calling on families to inform them that their son had been killed all at once, all within a short period of time. And the American news media did a 180-degree turn. The Voice of America, Walter Cronkite, announced on national television that he had changed his opinion, and the most we could hope for was a stalemate, that we would not win this war. And then the news media started to run on a daily basis the names and photographs. I guess they got them out of high school yearbooks, whatever, of all the men who had been killed that day, day after day after day. A little bit like the same sort of blitz that we get on a daily basis today with the political situation that's going on in the United States. And it's one thing to to listen to the day's news, which is, as we know, filled with the political environment. But it's a whole nother thing to have the daily news at the end of the news run a listing of all the soldiers who had been killed in Vietnam that day, day after day after day. And so Americans woke up and said, this is wrong. And protests on campuses it escalated, protests in the street escalated, and the entire American political opinion about the war, why we were there, what we were doing, did a 180-degree turn.
Yeah.
Now, none of that was aware. We were not aware of any of that in Vietnam. There was no news in Vietnam. We didn't get any news. I mean, every once in a while, somebody'd send a clipping home from the States, but we didn't have any newspapers. We didn't have any television. We were out in the boonies. So we had no idea that, for the most part, we had no idea that any of this was going on until we received like a new soldier coming into the unit who would have stories. But that was just one person, or two people, whatever.
Well, that's kind of what I was wondering was like, could you feel that, or was it so removed that like you weren't a part of the world, as you called it? You're like, we're in a different place. We have no idea what's going on. We are here doing the day to day and
following orders. That's right.
We will do so until we go home. And hopefully when we go home, it's not the homecoming that, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And how long after that did you come back? Because that was right around the start of your tour, right?
I started May the 9th, 1968, and you were supposed to serve 1 year in Vietnam. And I had a staff job, and I convinced my boss, because an officer fills out a form called a dream sheet, and you put down where you would like to be assigned for your next tour of duty. Now, I was a regular Army officer, so I wasn't coming back to get out of the service. I was going on to my next duty station. And I put down that I'd like to be assigned to the West Coast. Now, that meant Fort Lewis, Washington, or Fort Ord, California. And I didn't get orders, And so I talked my boss into letting me go to Saigon for 3 days, ostensibly to buy art supplies for our unit and to find out what my orders were. So after 2 days of R&R and little sightseeing in Saigon and eating steaks and drinking cold beer at the officers club, I found my way to MACV headquarters. That's Military Assistance Command Vietnam, and was ushered into a gymnasium, an actual gymnasium with the basketball hoops pulled up. And on the floor of this gymnasium were these low wooden trays. The computer processing of those days was Fortran punch card processing. And there were 58,000 punch cards in these low trays, each one for a soldier in Vietnam. So we went down the line alphabetically, A to B to BA to BAR to Bartlett John, Bartlett Peter. Here you are. You are going to Fort Wainwright in Seattle, Washington. And I said, wait a minute. I went to high school in Seattle, Washington. There is no Fort Wainwright in Seattle, Washington. Do you mean Fort Lewis? And they said, no. It says APO Seattle. That means Army Post Office Seattle. So we had to get a directory to look up where Fort Wainwright was located. And Fort Wainwright is located in Fairbanks, Alaska. So my next duty station was from 105 degrees in Vietnam to fortunately I went in the summertime, so it was about 60 to 65 degrees. So that was a big shock. But I wrote to my parents and I said, listen, I can't tell you exactly when I'm coming home, but it'll be sometime between May the 7th and May the 11th. And when I get there, then I'll call you and you can come pick me up. Well, my father after World War II, he was an engineer, and he had been promoted at that point up to the rank of major. And they said, we're going to drop you down to first lieutenant because after World War II, we don't need these higher ranking officers. And the Air Force said, well, listen, we need engineers. And my father was a concrete specialist. He said, we need somebody to go around and inspect all these NATO airfields. And if you come with us, we'll make you a lieutenant colonel. So he became an Air Force officer. And so he was at that point in time, he had become a full colonel. He had retired, but he had some pull in the Air Force. And he was able at Fort Travis Air Force Base in California to find out a little bit about the flights coming in from Vietnam. And my parents literally met every flight coming back from Vietnam from May the 7th until I returned on May the 9th. Every flight. Well, they figured out not to meet the Marine flights because I wouldn't be on that one. But they met every Army flight coming in from Vietnam from May the 7th until I returned on May the 9th. And interestingly, my wife was born on May the 9th. My youngest son was born on May the 9th. And I have tried to play 5-9 in every possible conceivable combinations, and I've never won anything.
That's too bad. And you're like, when you got your relocation order to Alaska, you had to be like, look, I said West Coast, but
they laughed at me. When we went to the directory, there were a couple other officers there. They were just hilarious that I was going to Fairbanks, Alaska. I was not so happy, but it turned out to actually be a pretty good assignment.
Okay. So what were those first, obviously you met your parents at the airport, which is, an incredible experience when you've been separated from the world as you know it for so long. What were those first few, days, weeks like as you came back to more normalcy?
So, most of the men who got off that plane or were arriving back in Vietnam went through processing, were put on buses and taken to Oakland Army Terminal, and then given pay. I mean, these are non-commissioned officers and enlisted men. Officers had orders, so they knew where they were to go, and most of them were just released. This is the time when so many soldiers were spit upon, and I mean, they would go into San Francisco, and you could tell they were military because they had short haircuts. They threw away their uniforms. Didn't want to be recognized. It was an awful period of time for so many of those soldiers. But when my flight landed in Travis Air Force Base, it was 11 o'clock at night, and I looked out the window of the airplane, and I saw two people standing on the other side of the fence. And I said, those are my parents. And we were all dressed the same. So I got within about 2 feet of my mother before she finally recognized me. And I kissed her through the fence. But I was released right then and there, and spent the night in the bachelor officers' quarters at Travis Air Force Base. And my parents lived down in Monterey, so we drove down the highway, and I spent about 2 weeks at home getting my car ready to go to Alaska, because you had to do all kinds of special things to prepare your car for the cold winter, and buying uniforms, getting uniforms, and so I didn't have any interaction with the public, and I was still in the Army. When I got to Alaska, I was in a close-knit military environment, lived in a bachelor officer's quarters, interacting with other military people. So I did not have any contact with American public.
Do you think that kind of having that close community that you get, when everyone around you is kind of in the same boat, where you're like, oh, everyone here is either served in the same place I was or is going to, and they know the same structure that do you think that helped
to some extent? I had hoped that there would be some opportunity to communicate, and I was the first. But by the way, I got promoted to captain on the day I arrived. My date to be promoted was June the 6th, and I arrived there in late May, and I met the brigade commander, who was a full colonel, and he said, well, we're going to send you on down to the battalion as a captain. You're due to be promoted next month anyway. And they brought there was one captain in the brigade. I mean, all of the officers were in Vietnam. I was the first officer to come back into that unit from Vietnam. Several more followed me. But they had him take the bars off his uniform and pinned them on me. I was 24 years old, and I was instantly promoted to captain, and I was put in charge of a headquarters company, $25 million worth of material and equipment. It was a mechanized unit, meaning tracked vehicles, ambulances, 2.5 ton trucks. I knew nothing about vehicles, nothing about motor pool. And these were all World War II vehicles. So none of them ran. Everything was redlined. And we couldn't get parts because the priority for parts was to Vietnam. So we would spend all our time just trying to get these vehicles to run. We would go on a maneuver, and within the first 5 miles, we'd lose 50% of our vehicles overheating. So that was quite an experience for a brand new captain. And I must admit, I probably didn't perform very well. Just lack of knowledge, lack of experience, and trying to do the best I could. That was not my forte. My forte was administrative as the S1.
Yeah. You're like, boy, I'm sure glad we didn't need these vehicles because they don't run.
Well, and finally, that somebody got smart and they packed them all up onto a railhead and shipped them down to the National Guard, got rid of all the vehicles, and we converted to light infantry, snows and skis. Everybody had to learn how to snowshoe and to do cross-country skiing. So that was a little more effective of unit and training. But it was a brigade. Brigade was about 2,000 men. We were the first line of defense in the event the Russians came across the Bering Strait. It was ridiculous. We could never have stopped an enemy infiltration. We fire one shot and run like hell. That would be that would be what we could do.
Hey, better than nothing, I suppose, right?
Yeah. Well, they had to have some sort of a security force there. I mean, most of the time was spent putting out forest fires.
So then, how long after you got to Alaska, I assume you did, some term of service there. How long before you returned from the military to, civilian life?
So again, I was a regular Army officer. I spent 2 years in Alaska, and then I received orders transferring me to the career course back to Fort Benning, Georgia, the infantry career course. And so I made my way to the Office of Personnel Operations. I decided I'd check in to see what the Army had planned for me. And I met with this major in the Office of Personnel Operations, and he was my advisor. And I thought it was very strange because he was an armor officer and I was an infantry officer. And I had been in combat and he had not. And he said to me, "Oh, Captain Bartlett, you are in the top 5% of your class. We're going to send you to the career course at Fort Benning, Georgia. Then we're going to send you to the Monterey Language Institute, teach you how to speak Vietnamese, and send you back to Vietnam for your second tour as a Vietnamese unit advisor." And I said, that's not exactly what I had in mind. And I told him what I wanted to do was go to Germany and be a military attaché. And he said, "Okay, well, we can talk about that when you come back from your second tour in Vietnam." And I said, "Well, that's not what I want to do. I've got 2 Purple Hearts, and there's one job that's worse than being an infantry platoon leader, and that's being a Vietnamese unit advisor. They have a lower life expectancy even than a platoon leader." And he said, "Well, this is what we have you programmed for." I said, "Well, unprogram me because I want out." And he said, "Well, look, you've accepted orders transferring you from Alaska to Georgia. Therefore, you are obligated for an additional year of service right now. And if you choose not to go to the career course, then we will send you back to Vietnam right now. Take the weekend and think it over." So I did. I called my father. I talked to him. I just said, "I'm not going to be programmed. This is not don't want to go back to Vietnam. I don't want to be a Vietnamese unit advisor." So I came back and I said to this major, "Okay, send me back to Vietnam right now, but I want my resignation on file for 365 days from today's date." And I had 30 days of leave coming that would shorten my tour by a month. I would get another 30 days of vacation, so that would shorten it another month. I figured I could get away with 8 months in Vietnam, or 10 months in Vietnam. And then so this major goes and huddles with another two majors, and then he comes back and he says, well, let's not be hasty. Here, the Army has spent all this money to move you and your family from Alaska to Georgia. Well, I knew right then and there he hadn't even looked at my records because I was a bachelor and everything I owned fit in my car. So for the first time in my life, I was smart and I kept my mouth shut. And he said, we're going to go ahead and send you on down to Fort Benning, Georgia. They'll make you an instructor or they'll find a job for you. And I said, okay, that sounds good. And so I ended up back at Fort Benning for the last 2 years, for 2 years. And I was with the leadership department of the infantry school, which was like a management department of a college. And that was a really good assignment. And I got placed on a group of officers responsible for developing a course of instruction that was implemented Army-wide, and preparing a book of readings and lesson plans, overhead transparencies. This was before PowerPoint. And it was a very good assignment and actually sort of started me toward my civilian career, which was in publishing.
Nice. Yeah, you're like, I would like to refuse this death sentence, please.
Yes.
So, after you got out, did you feel, like you fit in with, every day, every other person that you saw, walking in and out of the grocery store? Did you feel like, oh, we're the same kind of people?
So I actually started interviewing for a civilian job while I was still in the Army and ended up accepting a position with Prentice Hall Publishing Company as a textbook sales representative. And was my territory was in Southern California. Actually called in my own college. And my job was to call on college professors and tell them about all these wonderful textbooks that we had. And it was a tough transition because I was coming out of a, highly organized military organization where everything was done by the book, lots of rules, and living in a very free society, but doing my job. And I enjoyed it very, very much. I was good at it. Got promoted and ultimately came back to the East Coast, which is where all the publishing was, and it stayed pretty much in publishing related positions for my civilian career.
There you go. And now you have your own book out as well.
Yes. So for a very long time, I was on the marketing end and sales end and thought I knew a lot about books, selling books. And I had worked in textbooks and trade books and medical books and and journals, selling and marketing. And I thought I knew a lot about book sales and book publishing, and I did. But what was missing was what it was like to be an author. And that's for the last year, my book was published this year. For the last year, it has been a real eye-opener and learning experience and I had a wonderful publisher, very, very pleased with my publisher and the production of my book. My book was published by Casemate Publishers, which is really a military book publisher. And I was very happy with the cover design. I was very happy with my publisher, very happy with the interior design. And they were demanding that the book be just as clean and as accurate. I went through 4 revisions, and I was very, very fortunate to have a wonderful proofreader who was a college classmate of mine. And she found every misplaced comma, every misspelled word, and she asked a whole bunch of WTF questions. And I figured if she didn't understand what I was talking about, I needed to rewrite that section. And I sent the manuscript out to a couple of a number of friends, and the military friends all said, "Oh, this is wonderful, publish it." But 2 people that I knew, one a classmate and one what was called a book shepherd, that's someone who helps an author shepherd their book through the production process, said, "Well, I guess you just want to sell this book to military people, right? You don't want to sell this to the general public." And I said, "No. I want to sell it to the general public. I want it accessible." And they said, "Well, you better do something about all this military jargon and you better put some of your personal feelings in, because right now it's just a straight memoir. So that caused me to rewrite the entire book. And I remembered that my mother had saved every letter that I wrote home from Vietnam. And she left them in the original envelope, so they were all date stamped. So I put these more than 100 letters in chronological order, and I reread every letter. And then I reached in and I grabbed snippets from the letters and I put them into appropriate chapters. So you could read what I wrote in the event, how I described the event, and then you could read what I wrote home. And they weren't always quite the same story. There's a little bit of a juxtaposition there. But yeah, as I said, it took me the better part of 10 years to write it and another 2 years to rewrite it, and then a year to get it produced by the publisher. But I'm very, very pleased with the production job, with the cover. It was my photo, the photo of the book, and that photograph is the platoon leader's view of a helicopter combat assault. So that was the view that I saw more than 50 times over the pilot's shoulder as we were making a helicopter combat assault, except when my platoon's turn was to lead the assault, and then I was in the first helicopter, and that was a little different view.
Well, and this book, number one, has a beautiful layout. The way that things are just like, you interspersed your letters into it, and there's different clippings from news pieces or pamphlets or the pictures that were found that just like get dropped in throughout this book. It's wonderful. And then reading it, it's in very small pieces so that you're like, I was just reading the FNG chapter, which when people read it will know what they're talking about. But I was just reading through that, and it's like, the whole section's pretty short and it stands apart from everything else. So if you put this book down and then just pick it up, you can start every new chapter and not feel like you need to reread anything. You're just like, next chapter, let's go.
In fact, I could not remember the chronology. So, as I said earlier, each chapter kind of stands alone, and there are a number of chapters that are horrific, and then there's some. I tried to mix in some funny things too, and as I mentioned, there were several things that happened to me that were really quite unusual and did not happen to other veterans, and so I thought those stories were kind of worthy of telling.
Yeah, that chapter alone has a number of pretty good stories where it's the guy leaving his gun loaded and absent-mindedly kind of ends up blowing a couple of his toes off, and a guy that, for lack of better words, explodes the latrines. So it's like this book is chock full of really good detailed stories, and I really appreciated it. And I have appreciated your time here. I kind of wanted to get, as we close this out, there is a section at the start of your book that I thought was very powerful. And you're talking about, when speaking to a Vietnam vet, there is a better phrase than thank you for your service. And that was welcome home.
Vietnam veterans are starting to walk in the boots of our World War II and Korean veterans. World War II vets are all 100, 90, 99, 100, 101. Korean, they're in their 90s. And so Vietnam veterans are the veterans that you encounter today. They're the ones you see marching. They're the ones who are participating in VFWs and American Legions. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with acknowledging a veteran's service with the words, thank you for your service. But because of the reaction of the American public to Vietnam veterans upon return, and because Vietnam is acknowledged as the first American war that we lost, and Vietnam veterans often are held responsible for that loss psychologically, they never got the welcome upon return that World War II vets did and some Korean vets did. There were no parades. There was no acknowledgement. And because of the way they were treated, most Vietnam vets just packed it all in, didn't talk about it. In fact, when my book was published, I've had so many friends come up to me or write me and say, had no idea you were a veteran, had no idea you were in Vietnam, because you just didn't talk about it. My family, I didn't even talk about it to my family. So the words welcome home are special to Vietnam veterans. And if you recognize a Vietnam vet, they're the ones that that say Vietnam veteran on their hat. Um, if you say those words, welcome home, and those words can be said to any veteran, but if you say them to a Vietnam veteran, it gives a special meaning to your greeting, to your acknowledgement of the sacrifice that we made, and it can be a real game changer for those veterans to receive that kind of acknowledgement.
Absolutely. Well, Robin Bartlett, thank you again for being here. Tell everybody one more time where they can find your book and more from you if
Sure.
they're looking for it.
So if they come to my website, which is www.robinbartlettauthor.com, and by the way, there's a female actress by the name of Robin Bartlett. Don't get confused. www.robinbartlettauthor.com. You can get my book at a discount, autographed, and free shipping. And plus, there's a wealth of information on my website. You can spend hours there. I've got a lot of stuff, videos, photographs, and a lot of information. So it's a fascinating website. Worked very hard on it.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you again for being on here. If anyone out there goes and picks up this book, wherever you're picking it up, if there was an option to leave a review somewhere, if you're buying this, from Amazon or you're picking it up, on an online book retailer, leave a good review for it. I know I harp on this a lot, but it is a very big deal for authors like Robin.
Thank you.
I know war topics aren't the cheeriest, but it's an important reminder to reach out to the people in your life who might otherwise have a very hard time feeling like they can reach out for help. We're halfway through the last month, so here are the updated rankings. Number 1, the United States, still led by New York, Oregon, and South Carolina. Number 2, Germany, losing ground but still holding the spot. Number 3, Canada, rocketing up the chart thanks to all of the wonderful listeners in Ontario. Number 4, the United Kingdom, led by England. And number 5, Australia, with New South Wales responsible for them staying on this list at all. That's it for this week. Have a great week, a great weekend. I'll see you all back here for the next episode just before Christmas. Wow. Until that next episode, please do all those things that help the show grow, like rating, reviewing, liking, and subscribing. Remember, you can reach out to dumbenoughpodcast@gmail.com or on any of the social medias if you want to reach me personally. But most importantly, stay dumb.